All right, I think we are good to get started. So, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Shella Chowdhury and I'm a research associate here at the Environmental Law Institute. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Clean Air Act regulations for natural disaster management. This is a program sponsored by the local government. Sorry about that. This is a program sponsored by the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network, or LGEN, which ELI manages under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I encourage you to follow the events page on LGEN's website, lgean.net, and to connect with us on social media for future programs. Thanks to our outstanding panelists and moderator for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar. The full speaker bios are available on the webinar's event page on the LGEN and ELI websites. At the conclusion of today's panel presentations, we have time for a Q&A session. So please ask these leading experts your questions. You can submit your questions through GoToWebinar's question box. Please don't wait until the end. You can send your questions as soon as you think of them. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's panelist and moderator. First, we have Sarah Ayers. Sarah works in the EPA Office for Enforcement and Compliance Assurance and is the National Compliance Lead for stationary engines. She is a mechanical engineer for training, or by training, and has worked on engine compliance questions for approximately 8 years. Next, we have John Cox. John joined EPA in the summer of 2016 and also works in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance as a physical scientist on several air regulations. His work focuses primarily on chemical and surface coating source categories, as well as asbestos. Next, we have Marcia Mia. Marcia has been employed as a chemical engineer with the EPA since 1991. Marcia's areas of expertise are the Clean Air Act requirements for stationary sources in the chemical and allied industries and oil and gas sector. Marcia also has extensive experience implementing regulations relating to solid waste combustion sources. And finally, we have our moderator, Cynthia Harris. Cynthia is the Director of Tribal Programs and the Deputy Director for the Center for State, Tribal, and Local Environmental Programs at ELI. Her projects focus on climate change, tribal and indigenous issues, water quality and conservation, product life cycle management, green infrastructure, and forestry management and conservation. Cynthia, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Shella, and thanks to our audience and our wonderful panel, Sarah, John, and Marcia. My name is Cynthia Harris, here with the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network and the Environmental Law Institute. Welcome you to this webinar, Clean Air Act Regulations for Natural Disaster Management. Shella, if we could turn to the next slide, please. To set some context for today's discussion, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, there are $22 billion disasters in the US in 2020, up from a prior record of 16. We're talking about everything from flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, to severe storms. Local governments, of course, focus on immediate response to save lives and property, but inevitably, there's the post-disaster response, cleanup. Next slide, please. Now, what does that involve? Emergency engines when the power system is down, toxic substances like asbestos released when structures are damaged or demolished, temporary use of incinerators to handle the post-disaster debris. All of these impact our air quality. But just what are local governments' responsibilities, particularly under Clean Air Act regulations? That's what we're covering here today specifically. So let's get started. We're very fortunate to have a panel of EPA experts on these issues here with us today. We'll begin with Marcia, who will introduce this topic, and then Sarah will delve into emergency engines. Marcia?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm honored to be able to share some knowledge from myself and my coworkers here at EPA. As noted, the focus of this webinar is on some specific Clean Air Act regulations that we get a lot of questions on when there is a natural disaster. And here we really are focused on natural disasters such as earthquakes, tornadoes, volcanoes, floods, and not other types of disasters that might come from acts of terrorism or the such. It generally has responsibilities under the National Response Framework, and that aims to help the whole community prepare for and respond to short-term from disasters, including those that might require a coordinated federal response. And in addition to these sort of regulations that we're going to be talking about today, focusing on emergency engines, incinerators, and management of asbestos, there's a lot of other programs and regulations which either may be applicable or may exist to help government and tribes prepare for and respond to natural disasters. As I mentioned earlier, we are part of the National Response Framework, and we are the nation's lead federal agency for responding to the inland releases of chemicals and oil. We also empower states through our right to know information about the chemicals in the communities. These efforts are led out of our Office of Land and Emergency Management, the Office of Emergency Management. Sarah, John, and I all work in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, specifically in the Office of Compliance, and we assist with helping states and tribes understand their requirements under the regulations. We assist our inspectors in developing the skill sets that they need to be able to conduct inspections against those regulations. And then we work very closely with our program to ensure that the regulations have sufficient compliance monitoring so that the that are subject to those regs know what they have to do to comply, and that our inspectors and stakeholders know how to measure compliance against those requirements. In addition to these Clean Air Act regulations that we're going to talk about today, under the Clean Air Act and during a natural disaster, we might also conduct monitoring of areas that might be impacted by natural disasters. Generally, when dealing with waste management, we have a hierarchy that we use that focuses primarily on source reduction and reuse as a preferred option of treatment. And then finally, if necessary, disposal options, which might include incineration. We have a lot of folks at EPA who are in our Office of Land and Emergency Management whose responsibility is on this source reduction, on this more generic disaster response. We're hoping that these type of webinars generated interest, and we're able to follow up with some additional topics on our general authorities. But for today's purposes, those are beyond the scope of this, and we really are focused on these three specific Clean Air Act regulations, how they might be impacted during a disaster response, and what you'll need to know to be able to comply with those regulations and to work with your communities to get back to recovery. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sarah, who's going to kick us off by talking about emergency engines.
Okay, so if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about emergency engines operating during natural disasters, but first, if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about just stationary engines in general. So, why do we regulate stationary engines? So they're pretty common combustion sources. They can impact air quality and public health. They pollute the air. They operate pretty similar to a mobile engine. So you can understand, we have experience with how annoying it can be to be breathing a car or truck exhaust. But a stationary engine is, not moving around, and it then therefore can cause, sort of concentrated emissions in the area near them. And also, there are a lot of these engines out in the world, stationary engines. As the slide says, they are commonly used at power plants, manufacturing plants, and as backup generators in a lot of places that might need to have emergency power. The data here is a little bit old, but when we were doing one of the more recent rules for stationary engines back in 2010, the estimate was that there were almost 1 million engines that were affected by that rule, with more coming into service all the time. That's including all the stationary engines, not just emergency engines, but there are a good number of emergency engines out there. If you could go to the next slide, just to give you a brief overview. These are some of the pollutants that are emitted from a stationary engine or a mobile engine, but in our case, we're talking about stationary. Obviously, it can cause breathing issues, and in extreme cases, some central nervous system problems. So the EPA regulations are intended to minimize these hazards from people who live or work near these sources of pollution. And even in the event of a natural disaster, we still want to make sure that people are not unduly exposed to these types of toxins. Okay, so the next slide talks about when we get into these reciprocating internal combustion engines, which we have commonly called RICE, and there are people refer to the RICE rules. There are 3 of them, 2 NSPS rules, which are the new source standards, and then the NESHAP, the hazardous air pollutants rules. They have special provisions in the rules for emergency engines because many municipalities, medical facilities, industrial facilities, other organizations have installed backup generators to provide emergency power in case of losing the grid power during a natural disaster or other disruption. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what is an emergency engine. Many of these facilities have backup generators. They provide power in the case of an emergency, but the term emergency itself is not specifically defined in any of the 3 RICE rules. But EPA is typically considered emergency situations to be an unexpected loss of grid power due to factors outside the control of the facility, like a natural disaster, some sort of a power grid failure, or an extreme weather event. As you can see here in the excerpt from the NESHAP subpart Quad Z, we note that an emergency stationary RICE is operated to provide electrical power or mechanical work during an emergency situation. That's where they state the term emergency, but it's not specifically defined in the definition section. It then goes on to give examples. So examples include stationary RICE used to produce power for critical networks or equipment when electric power from the local utility is interrupted, or stationary RICE used to pump water in the case of fire or flood. I will note that typically the potential for loss of life or significant damage to property is usually, EPA usually considers that to be present in an emergency situation. So, this particular rule does not necessarily require a specific type of a disaster declaration, but a lot of, in the case where there is one, that's likely to be considered an emergency under this rule. So emergency engines are also allowed to operate for limited amounts of time in non-emergency situations. Typically that's for like required testing and maintenance, but there are a few additional situations where they are allowed to operate. The next slide goes on to talk a little bit about what the operational limitations are for these specific types of engines. So during an emergency, they're basically allowed to have unlimited use. Like I said, there's no specific RICE rule language on use during natural emergencies, natural disasters, but generally most natural disasters would meet sort of the language that is listed there as example under the emergency engine citation that I showed you on the last slide. They are also allowed 100 hours per year for maintenance and testing. And of that, they say 50 of those 100 hours could be used for what would be considered a non-emergency situation if there's no sort of financial arrangement. So there's a possibility they could be used for local reliability in a bunch of really specific circumstances if it's dispatched in a certain way. But generally those 100 hours is what they would be allowed to be used when it's not during an emergency. So if they were to operate more than the 100 hours, then they would no longer be considered an emergency engine, and then the rest of the non-emergency engine provisions in the rule would potentially apply to that unit. If you can go on to the next slide. So like I said, none of the RICE rules have language specific to use after the initial emergency is over. So once the grid power is again available, emergency RICE would be subject to any of the limitations on non-emergency use. And if the emergency engine is used for more than the allowed 100 hours in a non-emergency situation, it would no longer be considered an emergency engine under the rule, and it would be subject to the rule requirements that would apply to any non-emergency engine of whatever size and type that the emergency engine was. And so they're actually certified as emergency engines under the rule, and so they would basically lose that certification, at least for the rest of that time period, and then they would be subject to whatever non-emergency engine, whatever subcategory they would fall into at that point. So I think that finishes up the brief overview of the stationary engines, and I think John is going to be next to talk with us about asbestos.
Hi, yes, so now let's talk about asbestos. So I have two pictures here for you. On the left, we have the serpentine type asbestos, and on the right, we have the amphibole. These are two major classifications for asbestos, and the major difference between them being the serpentine on the left, you can see are more fiber-like and like a serpent. And on the right, you have the amphibole series, which are shorter in length, typically sharper, and can cause, can therefore pierce the lungs a little bit more effectively. So we'll go to the next slide and see some more. So what is asbestos? The term asbestos is generically used to refer to 6 different types of naturally occurring mineral fibers. And you can see them here on the bottom. I have pictures here. So like on the first slide, we saw the serpentine asbestos. That would be the chrysotile. That's commonly found in brake pads. And the following 5 are under the amphibole category. These are the shorter in length, typically sharper, and have been found in different insulations in the past. So we can go to the next slide. So the characteristics of asbestos, what made asbestos so appealing back in the day? You can see asbestos can be found in bundles of fibers. They can show high length and diameter aspect ratios, and some forms are sufficiently flexible to be spun. But the main 6 properties, or 5 rather, that were sought after for asbestos were that asbestos is non-combustible, it's thermally stable, it's resistant to biodegradation, it's chemically inert, and also has a low electrical conductivity. All these properties made it very appealing to be used in many different facilities back in the day, and it's everywhere from factories into schools. But now we know that asbestos actually has several health effects that make it worrisome for the public, and we can see those on the next slide. So the 3 major asbestos-related diseases are asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma. Primarily, asbestos affects the pleura, the lung lining of your lungs, and can cause pleural plaques and thickenings, scarring rather, as well as effusions. All of these can cause a variety of health effects. Additionally, it's been reported that exposure to asbestos can lead to other increased cancers as well. We can go to the next slide. So here, EPA comes in here. So what does the asbestos NESHAP regulate, or what does it require rather? An owner and operator of a facility is responsible for the following 4 bullets. But before we get into those, a facility is essentially any commercial, industrial, even residential, or really it's just any building. But for the purposes of the NESHAP, it does not include residential structures with 4 or fewer dwelling units. So a single family home would not be considered a facility. So the first thing that's required of the owner or operator is a thorough inspection of the facility that will be renovated or demolished. That thorough inspection needs to identify regulated asbestos-containing materials, otherwise known as RACM, that are friable, as well as non-friable asbestos that will become friable during demolition. And we'll discuss these terms in the future slides. But if the combined amount of friable and non-friable asbestos that will become friable is greater than 260 linear feet on pipes or 160 square feet on facility components, then the NESHAP comes into play. And finally, all RACM must be contained and disposed of at an asbestos-approved landfill per the requirements of 61-150, and that's the NESHAP. So we can go to the next slide. So before we get into those terms that I mentioned in the previous slide, just wanted to show you a couple examples of some asbestos-containing materials. On the left, we have some drywall materials, otherwise known as a transite siding. It's very common, and joint compound, which is also used in wallboard systems. Modern day drywall materials and joint compounds should not contain asbestos. However, a lot of these materials have been put in place for many years now, and they're quite old. So these are known suspects. We can go next slide. So what is friable ACM? ACM standing for asbestos-containing material. So in order for something to be asbestos-containing, it must contain at least 1% asbestos. So any materials containing greater than 1% would be considered asbestos-containing. So now the term friable. Friable means that when dry, the asbestos can be crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to powder by hand pressure. I would not recommend doing that in the field. You don't want to expose yourself to asbestos, but that is what friable means. And finally, if the material contains less than 10% of asbestos, from the lab analysis, it must be further verified with point counting using polarized light microscopy. We can go next slide. So now what is non-friable asbestos? Again, it must contain at least 1% asbestos for it to be considered asbestos-containing. But if it is non-friable, when it is dry, it cannot be crumbled by hand pressure. And under the NESHAP, we have two categories for non-friable asbestos. We have category 1, which is essentially floor tiles and roofing products, and category 2 non-friable asbestos, which in short are pipe material. And if you look at these pictures, you see on the left, you see floor tile, and on the right, you see transite cement water pipe. This is not the perfect picture. This pipe actually looks friable, but I just wanted to show you, cement pipes are considered typically category 2 non-friable. We can go next slide. So on the previous slide, we introduced the term regulated asbestos-containing material, otherwise known as RACM, and it can fit into 4 different categories. The first category being friable asbestos material, which you see in the bottom left photo there. That is something that looks like it can be crushed by hand pressure. It already looks like it's in pretty damaged condition. The second being category 1 non-friable ACM that has become friable. And the second picture from the bottom left, that's some floor tile that was broken up due to force. Third picture we have is category 1 non-friable ACM that will be or has been subject to sanding, grinding, cutting, or abrading. So you can see I think there's someone with a shovel there kind of scraping up that tile. That's causing that non-friable ACM to become friable, therefore becoming regulated. And the final picture we have is category 2 non-friable ACM that has a high probability of becoming or has become crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to powder. So that's a pipe in this last bottom right photo that is being cut. So obviously there will be some fiber emissions there, and that would become regulated as well. But again, it must reach the threshold amounts that we talked about in the previous slides, 260 for pipes and 160 for facility components. Next slide. So the asbestos NESHAP covers several different things, but for the public, it mainly comes into play when we talk about demolition and renovation of facilities. And the big difference between demolition and renovation is that demolition involves the wrecking or removal of any load supporting structural member of a facility, and renovation really covers everything else. And one thing to note as well, the intentional burning of any facility is also considered a form of demolition. Next slide. So also in the previous slide, we talked about, or we mentioned, what is a thorough inspection. So some of you may already know this, but before you demolish or renovate a facility, a notification must be sent to EPA at least 10 days prior to the expected start date of the renovation or demolition. This will include documentation that a thorough inspection of the facility has been completed, and it should include the following information. It should include sampling locations and necessary field notes, photographs of materials, samples to be provided to a laboratory, as well as reports that describe these activities and analytical results. We can go to the next slide. So finally, that brings us to asbestos and catastrophic disasters. Like the stationary engines, the asbestos NESHAP also does not contain specific rule language regarding catastrophic disasters. EPA has put out a 2009 guidance for how to handle asbestos during these catastrophic emergency situations. However, it really just talks about the NESHAP requirements that we went over in these previous slides. So again, to reiterate, prior to demolition or renovation, owners and operators are still required under catastrophic disaster situations to follow all applicable NESHAP regulations. One thing to note, however, is that emergency provisions may allow notice of the demolition or renovation to be made 24 hours in advance instead of 10 working days. But that is the only difference under emergency situations. And yeah, that finishes up with asbestos, and I think we'll move on to Marcia, the next topic.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my camera back on. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So thank you, John and Sarah. And we'll go ahead and talk now about incineration of non-hazardous disaster debris. So you can go on to the next slide. So the Clean Air Act, if you're familiar with it, has various sections that give EPA its authority to write regulations. And the one specific to standards for incinerators is under Section 129. And that basically tells us that we are to establish standards of performance for all non-hazardous solid waste incinerators. And under Section 129, they give us 9 pollutants that we're to establish standards for both new sources and existing sources. And for convenience, and because these are standards of performance, when we promulgate these regulations, when we make them go through the notice and comment rulemaking, publish them in the Federal Register, they ultimately are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, and we place those in Part 60 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So they reside along there with other standards of performance, most typically new sources, but some existing source standards as well. So Section 129 tells us that we're to establish specific emission standards for 9 pollutants under Section 129. Those are particulate matter, SOx, HCl, NOx, carbon monoxide, lead, cadmium, mercury, and dioxin. Section 129 also directs us to regulate emissions from air curtain incinerators, where those of you may be familiar with air curtain incinerators, they're a much more rudimentary type of incinerator. Basically, there's 2 types. One type is the trench burner, which does not have a firebox. So if you have a trench burner air curtain incinerator, you're going to basically take that trench burner out to your site. You're going to have to dig a hole and install that incinerator in that hole to create a firebox. And then the other type of air curtain incinerator is the integrated combustion chamber, where it actually has a firebox. Again, these are often used in disaster recovery, especially in more remote areas where you have a lot of wood waste that you need to dispose of. And under Section 129, we have very limited regulations for certain air curtain incinerators that burn only wood waste, yard waste, and clean lumber. And instead of having to comply with the suite of standards for the 9 pollutants, they only have to comply with opacity limits. So that's the difference between a more regular incinerator and an air curtain incinerator. So you can go on to the next slide. So for our local and tribal governments, the most likely applicable regulation when you're dealing with disaster debris are going to be our new source performance standards or our emission guidelines for other solid waste incinerators. And other solid waste incinerators are those that burn less than 35 tons per day of municipal solid waste, or an institutional incinerator, which is basically one that is owned or operated by a prison or a military compound or a school. And those are regulated under our other solid waste incineration standards. And I'm going to be calling those OSWI for short. Local governments may also have other type of municipal waste combustors. They may have small municipal waste combustors, which are those that burn at least 35 tons per day and no more than 250 tons per day. And there's also large municipal waste combustors, which are those that burn greater than 250 tons per day. So if you combust any disaster debris in any type of municipal waste combustor, the appropriate standard is going to comply. But again, the most likely one that's going to come into play during a disaster response are going to be our OSWI standards. So those are the ones that I'm focused on here. Generally, they're structured the same. And they regulate the same 9 pollutants. It's just that as you get up in size, typically the standards become more stringent. So as I said, there's 2 types of standards for other solid waste incinerators. There are those that apply to new sources based on when those units were constructed, and then those that are not new OSWI units are subject to our existing source standards. And those would be subject under regulations that are promulgated in accordance with what we call an emission guideline. The emission guidelines in section part 60 are basically model rules that are given to the states to develop what's called a state plan. If a state does not develop a state plan, then EPA is to develop a federal plan. At this point, we do not have a federal plan for OSWI units, and there are no state plans for OSWI units. There are some states that have submitted what are called negative declarations that basically tell us that, hey, I don't have any of these types of units in my state. And there are 5 states, Florida, Kentucky, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, as well as the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have submitted negative declarations. But the bottom line is that if you've got a unit that was constructed prior to December 9th, 2004, while there is an emission guideline that establishes the requirements of what a rule would look like for those sources, currently there are no regulations for those existing units. So if your unit was constructed after December 9th, 2004, or undertook a special type of change on or after June 16th, 2006, they would be subject to our new source performance standards. So as we go through this, I'll be providing citations to both the NSPS and the EG, so that if you want to follow those, you can find the appropriate citation within those 2 regulations. All right, you can go ahead. As I said earlier, the OSWI standards apply to those types of units that burn less than 35 tons per day of municipal solid waste. And as I said, a local government could be an institution that might have their own incinerator. And if you have your own incinerator as part of a local government or tribe, there are no capacity limits for the waste that you burn that's generated within your institution. But during a community disaster, you're likely to be combusting debris that was generated, in a larger area. It's not generated at your prison or at your municipal center or at your school. It's been generated in the community, and therefore, if you're going to combust that waste in an OSWI unit, it's going to be subject to the 35 ton per day limit of municipal solid waste. So you can go on to, well, let me stay on this slide for just a minute, if you can go back. There are exclusions that apply to some OSWI units. There are several. Obviously, for the purposes of today's talk, we're really interested in temporary use incinerators and air curtain incinerators when those are used in disaster recovery. But the full list of exclusions can be found in those citations there on slide 28. So you can go on to the next slide. So unlike asbestos, we actually do come when there is a when these particular disaster response incinerators can be used, and we call that out specifically in the provisions of the NSPS and the emission guidelines. And basically, the incinerator is a used for disaster recovery if it's used to combust debris in one of two ways. It's either in an area that's declared a state of emergency by a local or state government, or it's been declared by the president under the authority of the Stafford Act that an emergency or a major disaster exists. So very narrow, but at least prescriptive, so that you know when the exclusions have been triggered. So you can go on to the next slide. So the general requirement for an OSWI unit used for disaster debris is that it can be excluded from the regulations for up to a period of eight weeks, and that is a start to stop time frame. It's exactly 8 weeks. It doesn't matter whether you're running for that 8 weeks or not. You start counting on day 1 and you stop counting on day 56, and that's the amount of time that you can use your 35 ton per day incinerator to combust disaster debris and be excluded from all of the OSWI regulations. The fine, I've got some of these sort of like what the fine print is here that you need to consider. For this, there's basically no notice required. There's no records that you have to keep under the OSWI standards, and you don't have to get a Title V permit. You do have to use it within the same emergency or declaration area in that 8-week period. All right, you can go on to the next slide. So you do have an opportunity to use it more than 8 weeks and less than 16 weeks and continue to be excluded from the OSWI limits, but you have to notify in this case, whereas before you didn't have to do anything. You can use it for eight weeks without having to do anything except, you know, combust your debris in the incinerator. If you want to use it more than eight weeks, you can use it up to 16 weeks, but you have to notify the administrator and get permission to use it for 8 additional weeks. And I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the fine print here. So in order to be eligible for the additional 8 weeks, you have to submit the notification within the first 8 weeks after you started operation of the unit. So if you remember on the previous slide, you don't have to keep any records or make any reports or get a Title V permit. But now, if you think you're going to be needing to use it for more than 8 weeks, now in order to determine that you've met this notice within 8 weeks, you actually are going to have some sort of record as to when you started it up, so that the administrator will be able to know that you're going to, at the end of the day, when we do all the math, that you're going to be operating it at a total of less than 16 weeks. So that's a little bit of fine print there that you need to consider. That if you think you're going to need it for more than 8 weeks, you know, go ahead and make sure that you can demonstrate, if asked, that you know, when you started using it, so that you can show that you're making the request within the initial 8 weeks from which you first started operation of the unit. All right, you can go on to the next slide. So we're very specific in the regulation as to what you have to include in that notification to the administrator to request to use the incinerator for an additional 8 weeks. Again, you've got to have the date that the unit was started within the emergency or disaster area, a specific identification of the disaster or emergency for which the unit's being used. You have to tell us what types of materials you're going to be burning, what does the unit look like, what size is it, what kind of design is it. Why do you need to operate it for more than 8 weeks? And how much time do you need up to the 16 weeks? And then give us a date that you expect you'll cease operation of that unit. All right, go on to the next slide. So, you know, there is still like one more chance if you've getting up to your 16 weeks and you're thinking that you're not going to get your area cleaned up in that period of time. You do have a couple of options. One is that you can go ahead and start complying with all of OSWE, or you can petition again to the administrator to ask that you continue to operate your unit. And you can if you get permission from the administrator, you can do that without complying with the OSWE limits or other requirements of the rule. The administrator, however, is going to specify a date by which you must cease operation of the unit. And if you don't get that, agreement back from the administrator before the end of your 16 weeks, if on the first day of the 17th week, you still don't have an answer from the administrator, you're going to have to either cease operation or you're going to have to start complying with OSWE. There's not sort of a blessing period while you're waiting for the administrator to respond. So make sure if you think you're going to be needing additional time, that you get that in plenty of time, that you can potentially get your approval from the administrator to continue operating. All right, you can go on to the next slide. I'm going to walk you through a few scenarios. We often get these questions when there is a natural disaster. So I created a few slides here that'll sort of walk you through some what-if scenarios. One of the questions we often get is, if I have an OSWE unit, can I move it around? And the answer is yes, within the boundaries of the current emergency or disaster declaration. If you move it outside of that emergency or disaster declaration area, then you're going to start a new 8-week clock and start having to follow the requirements anew. If you move it around within the existing boundary of an emergency or disaster declaration, it does not restart the 8-week clock. So again, that 8-week clock is continuous. It's regardless of whether it's operating or not, regardless of whether it's being moved around within the current emergency or disaster declaration area. All right, next slide. So air curtain incinerators. What if I own or operate an air curtain incinerator that only burns 100% wood waste, 100% clean lumber, 100% yard waste, or 100% mixture of any of these wastes? Can I still use the temporary exclusion? So go on to the next slide. You can use the temporary exclusion, or you can opt to comply with the air curtain incinerator standards that are not going to limit you to the amount of time that you operate that ACI. You are going to have to meet an opacity limit of 10%. You are going to have to conduct initial and annual testing for opacity. There are some records and reports that you're going to have to submit, and you are going to have to obtain a Title V operating permit for that ACI. If you want to be able to operate it without the time restrictions. All right, next slide. Or you might do both. You might say, you know what, I'm gonna take my chances. I'm gonna operate my temporary incinerator. I know I've got up to 16 weeks. Hopefully I'll get everything done. If I don't, then I'm going to go ahead and move into compliance with the OSWE rule. So with ACI, you do have a little bit of flexibility there in how you might want to comply. All right, you can go on to the next slide. I did want to point out that there were some amendments to our OSWE rule. We proposed these on August 31st, 2020. By court order, they have to be finalized in May of 2021. We proposed amendments to both the NSPS and the emission guidelines. I provided links in the presentation to those proposed amendments, as well as a fact sheet. Of particular note is that there are no changes to the temporary use during disaster recovery. There was a proposed change for air curtain incinerators, and that we proposed to remove the requirement that an air curtain incinerator would have to get a Title V permit when it's only subject to the opacity standards. So those would be the ACI that are burning 100% clean wood waste, yard waste, or 100% of a mixture of those type of wood wastes. So I encourage you to follow those amendments. Again, the links are there, the fact sheet, and then be looking for the final amendments to be published in May of 2021. All right, and I think that wraps me up for the specifics on incinerators. Sarah has concluded her discussion on engines and John on asbestos. The last couple of slides are several different resources. The first set of resources on page 39 are specific to air quality, and encourage you to visit those to see what might be of interest to you. We do have a combustion portal that is similar to the this Compliance Assistance Center that local government environmental assistance network that ELI is the grantee to operate. We have other compliance assistance and centers as well as portals, and there is a portal dedicated to combustion, so I encourage you to visit that portal. Also, we have certain air monitoring technologies. Can go back to the previous page, 39. The last three bullets, we do have some particular air quality monitoring expertise. So there's some links there that talk about some of the ambient air monitoring that we might be able to do during a natural disaster. All right, and then the final slide on resources. I want to point you out, as I said, our Office of Land and Emergency Management is the sort of the home office for emergency management at EPA. We do have several websites that deal with natural disasters. I'm going to highlight the third and fourth. There's a very good tool called Planning for Natural Disaster Debris. That's a document, a guidance document that's got a wealth of information. There's also a link to a webinar that they have done to relay the information in that guidance document. It's very good. EPA also has a disaster debris recovery tool that has a lot of resources for helping communities plan for managing and responding to natural disasters. And then I provided some information at the end about our EPA compliance and enforcement programs, as well as those of you who are state and tribal and local inspectors. You're probably already familiar with our Inspector Wiki, but if you are a federal credentialed inspector, or an inspector with federal credentials, let me put it that way, then you have access to our materials and fed talent, and we do have a Rice 101 course there, as well as an asbestos course. So with that, I think that takes us to the closing slide, which provides some contact information. And I'm going to quit talking and hand it back over to our folks at ELI.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And now we're going to turn to our full panel for some Q&A, and a reminder to send in your questions if you haven't already. If we can bring everyone back on screen. So we'll go on here since we have such a great array of expertise here, and thank you so much for the great presentation. I know I learned quite a bit myself too. So we'll start off with a general one. We have a couple specific questions as well. So for each of you, a bit of a round robin, since fortune does favor the prepared, what would you say is the best one or two thing that local governments and tribal governments can do to prepare for disasters that bring into play these different items, emergency engines, preparing for power outages, release of asbestos, especially when in areas that have quite a bit of this older building stock in advance? And we'll start again with Sarah.
So, I mean, I think as Marcia just noted, we have some natural disaster planning resources and guidance on the websites that she mentioned. Unfortunately, as I noted earlier, we don't go into a whole lot of detail on stationary engines in any of that because it's not something that is, specifically something that people have a lot of, specific provisions in the rule that they need to deal with. I think in general, making sure that they know which of their engines are certified in which categories. So like, they may have some engines that are non-emergency engines and some engines that are emergency engines. And so in the event where they have a loss of power, they can certainly run their emergency engines during that time, during the what would be termed the emergency. But if they have other needs when the emergency is over, then they just have to make sure they know which engines are supposed to be run at which times and keep track of their hours and all that, which is all laid out in the regulations. But just in the case of natural disasters, making sure that everybody who might be operating the facility in those kinds of scenarios would know, what the proper procedures are. So I think just a little bit in general, the preparedness and the knowing that, two generators that are kind of sitting next to each other could be different, right? One could be an emergency generator and the other one may be a non-emergency generator, and they should be operated differently, in accordance with the rules. So just making sure that everybody is clear on what the procedures are in those kinds of scenarios.
That's a good point. John, any thought on asbestos? Again, I mentioned all that old building stock that some localities certainly have around.
Yes. So unfortunately with asbestos, the nature of natural disasters is that they're oftentimes very unpredictable. So in terms of the best thing local governments can do to prepare for such disasters, I suppose they could remove all of the asbestos that are in the buildings currently, but that would be, of course, not very feasible. I would say the main thing is just having a plan in place, knowing how they are going to handle the cleanup of, demolished structures in the case of a disaster. That could include things like having a prepared list of certified and approved asbestos contractors. I think that would be very helpful. And just being familiar with the NESHAP requirements and what's required of localities during natural disasters.
It's a good point. Maybe someday we'll come to the point where we are able to remediate a number of those buildings. It's a nice thought. I know EPA makes quite a few resources available to local governments as well as residents too.
Yes, and only friable asbestos is a danger to human health and the environment. If it's a non-friable condition, it's solid. There very likely will be no fiber releases from that. So yeah, exactly.
It's good to know. Marcia, do you have any thoughts on what local governments and tribal governments can do as far as preparing their incinerators and figure out whether it meets that 2004 cutoff date or not? I mean, what's your advice to governments in preparing for disasters that might require disposing of debris using incinerators?
Well, again, it's important to know which regulations apply. So it is important to know whether you have one of the newer units that's going to be subject to currently effective regulations, or do you have one that was built before 2004? That at some point there will be a federal plan developed for those units, and those units would have to meet those requirements. So it's important to know. We spend a lot of time in Office of Compliance dealing with applicability. So it's important to understand your applicability. What size unit do you have, and when was it constructed? Understand, when you have to keep records, and when you are excluded during that first 8-week period. But recognizing again that if you think that period's going to be extended, that at the end of the day you're still going to have to tell us when you started it up. So figure out how you're going to keep track of how long you operate the incinerator during a natural disaster. EPA has a lot of resources for disaster planning. We have a waste management plan website, which we can provide as a resource. I don't think that's on the resource slides, but we can get that so that you can share that with this group. And basically, regardless of whether it's an engine or it's asbestos or it's an incinerator, planning is essential, and we do have a lot of resources for helping you with that. Developing a resiliency plan, developing a response plan, helping you understand how you might conduct exercises under that plan, and ultimately, if you have to enact that plan, how you can incorporate those real life experiences into it. So sort of a life cycle planning process. So a lot of resources available, which we've provided here in these slides, and hopefully those will be beneficial to you.
There really is a wealth of information there. Thank you so much for providing that to our audience. And we have a few specific questions. The first one is for Sarah regarding losing status as an emergency engine. So once an engine loses its emergency status by being used more than 100 hours, is it then subject to non-emergency requirements? Can the engine ever be classified again as an emergency engine? Do you have any thoughts or advice for our listeners here?
Yeah, no, this is a pretty common question. So the 100 hours is within a calendar year. So they do, I mean, it doesn't reset, but like if you lose your status as an emergency engine during a particular calendar year because you've gone over your 100 hours, you would have to demonstrate compliance as whatever non-emergency subcategory you would otherwise be. But that doesn't mean that you can't go back to operating as an emergency engine the next calendar year, as long as you've done your appropriate compliance demonstration. So I mean, it would be a process to discuss with whatever delegated state or EPA region where the engine is located, letting them know what happened, and the fact that it was a non-emergency engine, but then that you intend to operate it as an emergency engine going forward. And you'd have to, again, keep track of your hours, because if it goes over again, you're back to demonstrating compliance again as a non-emergency engine. So, I mean, it does happen. It is, I don't want to say a hassle, but I mean, it's certainly something that you have to work with your delegated authority on. It's not something that just is real easy to flip-flop back and forth, which is somewhat intentional under the rules, because there are reasons why we, separated out emergency engines, because the assumption was that they weren't going to be operated very many hours, and so they have therefore fewer restrictions on them. So if people are continuously going over, then it's like, well, you really have a non-emergency engine. If you're needing to use it that much for non-emergency purposes, it's really a non-emergency engine and should be regulated accordingly.
Good point. And we have a couple of questions specific to incinerators. One of them is, what are the requirements applicable to open burning of debris? Does that depend on the state? Marcia, any thoughts?
Yeah, so EPA does not regulate open burning. That is a state and local the state and local set up those regulations for open burning. I think is the easiest way to say it. So EPA does not regulate open burning.
And in that case, folks would reach out to their state and local governments to find out what the regulations are on that.
Correct. There would be no federal regulations that would apply.
All right. Wonderful. And another incineration question is, are there any regulations, or are there regulations, if any, what are they, pertaining to hazardous waste, debris staging, transport, and storage between the onset of the disaster and when it is being handled and addressed?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes. So what are the regulations, if there are any, pertaining to hazardous waste, and then regarding debris staging, transfer, and storage between when the disaster begins and when it is being handled and addressed, the debris itself, I believe.
So the handling of hazardous waste during a disaster is, we're responsible for, this group is responsible for the air regulations. So we don't have the expertise on the RCRA side of things. So that might be something that is worth discussing or having a future webinar about to answer those questions.
Okay, so there are no specific.
Or if there's a people for us to, provide feedback with a contact person, we're happy to do that as well.
That's a good point. And I'm wondering here if the concern is if there are any specific pollutant concerns with regard to hazardous waste, but If not, we can get that information included. And we have an asbestos question here. Does EPA have asbestos-related information available in Spanish or other languages to share with community residents? And that's an excellent point as well. John, would you have any thoughts on resources for some of our participants who'd like to get some of this information out to community residents, especially those who speak other languages?
I am not aware of any. I believe there, many states probably should have this type of these types of resources to share, but I'm not aware of any resources in Spanish to share with community members.
And Sarah, this question is also about emergency engines, and I'm not sure if this is one that would fall under your purview, but the question is, are there any noise limits? Suppose you could call that one form of pollution, noise pollution.
Yeah, I do not know anything about noise limits. That's not part of the air pollution branch where I work. I also am not sure that would be something that, it kind of depends. If you're talking about in a workplace, that would be more of like an OSHA kind of requirement than an EPA requirement. So yeah, I'm not aware of that. And then of course there's also, sort of local noise ordinances that local governments would have. But again, that wouldn't be something that EPA would be aware of.
Yeah, the flip answer to that is when enough people complain about it. So there you go. And a question for the three of you, and you might be aware of some case studies or specific examples, but can you think of any examples for a local government that prepared very well or handled a disaster situation very well, or more broadly, any lessons learned that our audience can take away?
So I'll take a stab. So we don't have, I don't have a poster child necessarily, but in terms of sort of the best practices or, the communities that are best prepared, or those that have done, the homework beforehand. They understand where their management centers are, where they'll be able to take debris, whether they're going to be able, what kinds of debris they can incinerate, how they're going to manage their asbestos. Again, it's all, a lot of pre-planning, understanding how you're going to be able to segregate your waste, and have those plans in place. And then typically when things go badly, it's because you've done that work beforehand. You don't know where your resources are. You don't know where you can take your waste. You're not prepared with your incinerator to combust the waste that you can combust. You let your debris get commingled. So perhaps you might have an air curtain incinerator that you might be able to avail yourself of that 100% yard waste, but instead you've let that waste get contaminated. So now you have to deal with compliance with a whole regulation instead of a very narrow part of the regulation. And then not knowing where you're going to take things, not having pre-selected sites for disposal, and not having spent time on your waste management plan.
And for asbestos, similarly, I think the main thing that owners and operators and even local governments can do is be prepared and also be very familiar with the NESHAP requirements. Oftentimes in cases of natural disasters, buildings or facilities rather, they're in a state of disrepair, and oftentimes they're structurally unsound. And one thing I'd like to add from my presentation is that if a building is considered to be structurally unsound, a thorough inspection is not required. They can consider this entire building to be asbestos containing and they can knock it down. The last thing that you want though in these disaster situations is to be knocking down buildings and not being prepared. Finding out that there's asbestos in this building and you knocked it down, having a huge fiber release, that's the last thing you want in a disaster situation. So making sure everything's controlled as best as possible, disposed of. Sometimes there's more debris than is anticipated and landfills can't accept it all. So having alternatives is also very important. But yeah.
Sarah, would you have any thoughts to add on this?
No, there's not really much, like I said, other than making sure that you know which of your engines are certified as emergency and which are non-emergency engines, and keeping your records accordingly. So when you're in the thick of the emergency, you make sure that you're doing the right stuff.
Again, preparation is the theme of this webinar. And we do have another specific one about generators. So if a generator is rented during a period of time during the emergency, should this generator be classified as a stationary generator for the facility where it's being used?
So there are provisions in the rule that talk about what makes an engine a stationary engine, and I won't go into all of the details, but basically if it's in place for more than a year, it's considered a stationary source. And you can't, there are provisions there about if you're swapping out generators to perform the same function, that doesn't count as like a new generator, basically. So you can't just swap out and have, technically a different generator, but it's doing the same function. It counts in the 12 months. So, and then there's also special provisions for if it's a seasonal operation, like, a ski hill or something like that, that's only operated for a certain number of months. If you have it there for the entire operation of the seasonal operation, then that's also considered, a stationary source, even if that seasonal operation is less than 12 months.
A bit of a two-part question having to do with community outreach. So one element is, how does EPA conduct outreach so communities and local governments and tribal governments know about these rules? And also, how should this community, when they're running engines, when they're demolishing facilities that may contain asbestos and utilizing incinerators, how should they communicate with the community? So again, two-parter. How does EPA conduct outreach to communities about these rules and regulations? And what advice would you have on how local governments should communicate with the community itself during these processes? Who would like to take this first?
I can take it. So EPA, we have a very robust website. We have a section that deals with press releases when we have new regulations that come out, or guidance documents that come out. We do often issue a press release. There is a wealth of information on our websites, both for the Office of Compliance, as well as what we call the Program Office, which is the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, who actually write the regulations. You can find information specific to incinerators, specific to asbestos, specific to engines. So EPA, tries to communicate. We've also used the compliance assistance portals and the compliance assistance centers to engage with particular communities. So that's another very good resource. We typically, if there's an issue that we find a recurrent pattern of non-compliance, we often issue compliance advisories. If there's a case that was particularly noteworthy, we might issue an enforcement alert that will highlight what we discovered in that. And all of those are made available through some of those links that I provided for the enforcement and compliance website. So in terms of communities, EPA doesn't necessarily provide strict recommendations on what communities could do, but I mean, the same resources, make sure that you have those set up ahead of time, make sure that you have access to getting on the radio, getting on TV. Of course, now we have, Twitter, very good way to get out immediate information. So just encourage you to consider when you're doing your disaster planning, that you include communication as a key element of that, and know how you're going to get that information out there. And certainly you don't have to develop it all yourself. As I said, EPA's got a wealth of information. You can often piggyback on materials that EPA has already developed.
That's an excellent point. A number of communities have a fairly robust communication strategy for the community. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, in addition to the types of the materials that are publicly available on our website, in regard to the asbestos niche app, the idea was really to stay out of the community's hair. We don't regulate the single-family home. If a single-family homeowner wanted to demolish their home or renovate it, EPA would not get involved with that. There may be some states requirements that may apply, but in terms of the single-family homeowner, there are no requirements for that. And in terms of local governments knowing the rules, I think that's also why it's so important to have a list of certified contractors that can handle asbestos, because if they are certified, they will be very familiar with these regulations and how to approach them.
Terrific. And Marcia, what you were saying earlier about compliance advisory and enforcement alerts, that leads into the next question, which is how EPA enforces these rules and what are the consequences for failing to comply with these regulations that local and tribal governments should be aware of. So if the first couple warnings don't work, what are the next steps, and what are we're assuming that everyone who's watching this webinar is working hard to do the right thing, but just to set the context a bit more, what are the different stages and worst case scenarios, just so we have a good understanding?
Right. So EPA uses a combination of, sometimes we'll review reports that are submitted to the agency. Sometimes we'll go on site and do on-site inspections. There's different tools that we use depending on, how easy it is to get to a source, the size of the source, the amount of time. Of course, the most recent pandemic has necessitated, more creative ways of conducting compliance evaluations. But we do manage a very robust inspector credentialing program. We do credential state and tribal inspectors with federal credentials, and they carry out some of the work on the part of EPA. That in and of itself, the enforcement and compliance program might be something that you might wish to do a future webinar just to understand, how that works. We're happy to do that. But generally, inspections, review of the records, and then if we do find a violation, ultimately, if the party is found guilty, if it's a civil violation, unfortunately, the penalties are very high, or can be very high. The penalties can be as high as about $102,000 per day per violation. We recently updated our civil penalty policy with those new numbers to adjust for inflation. So it is important that that you do understand the regulations, but enforcement is just one tool in our toolbox. I mean, ultimately, we want everyone to comply. We want everybody to understand what their compliance obligations are. And we really start that in the rulemaking process, where we try to make sure that the regs are as clear as possible and that folks understand what their compliance obligations are. And then we try to provide those resources to the regulated community so that they know how to comply. You've got friendly faces behind, engines, asbestos, and incinerators now. So we encourage you to call us with any of your questions, because we do ultimately, at the end of the day, want compliance, and enforcement is just one tool in our toolbox for reducing emissions of harmful air pollutants.
Absolutely. The key here is compliance assistance. And thank you again for providing all this helpful information. And actually, we've been focusing a lot on local governments or municipal governments. So we have quite a few people here who are with tribal governments. So I'm curious, are there any specific resources, regulations, considerations that pertain to tribal governments that we should be aware of?
Sometimes the tribal governments, just like your state and local governments, might have more stringent requirements than the EPA requirements. So encourage you to, to know exactly, what the most stringent requirement is. If you're operating, in a Indian country, or if you're operating in a local government or a particular state. But there aren't any Indians Indian country specific regulations that apply for engines, asbestos, or incinerators. We do have resources for the unique needs of our tribal partners and operators in Indian country, and some of those are available at the in the Planning for Natural Disasters disaster debris document that we provided the link for in the other resources.
Wonderful. So we're going to wrap up here with just one final question, which is for each of you. And just what is a last takeaway you want to leave with our audience? And let's start with, say, John, would you like to start it off?
Sure.
What did we have the last day?
Yeah, let's see. Final takeaways. Well, I guess a final takeaway would be is that asbestos, it is everywhere. It's in our offices, it's in our schools, and it's in many, many buildings. But the concern, it really should just be around controlling it and keeping it in good condition. Because if it's in good condition in a non-friable state, then it has no concerns there. And in addition, in regard to natural disasters, just being prepared, like we said earlier, is the biggest thing you can do. Stay on top of the regulations, know who you're going to contact, reach out to regarding contractors. And I think if you follow those things, you'll be great.
Thank you, John. Sarah, would you have a final suggestion, final say when it comes to emergency engines?
Sure. So, I mean, like I said in my part of the presentation, there's nothing specific in emergency engines to natural disasters, but emergency engines sort of by their nature are intended to be used during emergencies, which often coincide with natural disasters. So, you kind of just have to follow the general rules of how you operate your emergency engine. We do have a lot of resources, as Marcia noted, specifically like off of the EPA website, like epa.gov/stationary-engines is a whole site that just talks about how to comply with the general stationary engine rules. And then within that, there's the three different types of engine rules, and then they each have what they call a regulation navigation tool. So you actually can click on that and it'll ask you questions about your engine, and then it'll get you to regulatory citations that may pertain to your specific type of engine if you need help figuring out, what subcategory you'd be in. And even if you wanted to put in hypotheticals, like you have an emergency engine, but what would happen if you didn't have an emergency engine? If it wasn't that, it should be able to tell you what your requirements would otherwise be. And then they also have, example forms and webinars that have been done, and whatever other guidance documents that the agency has in place for each of those different engine rules. So I think in general, being familiar with what you're supposed to do for general use of emergency engines is going to put you in a good place when you get into an emergency situation or a natural disaster situation.
Thank you, Sarah. And Marcia, any last thought?
I would just say that while incineration is sort of at the one of the least preferred options for for dealing with for waste management structure. I mean, you ultimately want to have source reduction, recycle where you can, use for fuel as energy recovery, but sometimes you do have to incinerate. And fortunately, under the OSME standards, EPA has recognized this and has provided for limited exclusions from compliance with the regulation to manage disaster debris. So make sure that you're familiar with those so that you can take advantage of those and help to get your community cleaned up and back to normal as soon as possible.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, everyone. And if we could skip ahead to the final slide here. Perfect. And we really appreciate all three of you shedding light on how the Clean Air Act regulations apply to local and tribal governments when responding during and after a disaster, especially as noted as more and more local tribal governments are working on building resiliency and making preparations. Again, this has been a key theme of this webinar, is being prepared. And to our audience, we really encourage you to take advantage of all the resources mentioned today. There's just an incredible wealth, as we've heard from everyone, and to reach out to any of our panelists who very bravely made their phone numbers and emails available. So you'll probably be receiving some follow-up questions from folks. And we'll be posting the presentation and these resources on the LGN website. And finally, we do encourage you all to check out lgn.net for a wealth of resources on how local and tribal governments can meet their federal environmental obligations, from water to soil and air, especially air, right? And to connect with us on social media as well. Shella?
Just want to say thanks again to Cynthia and to our fantastic panel, Sarah, John, and Marcia. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we hope you'll join us for our next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.